The Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference is coming to Dallas, Texas, February 16, 17, and 18 in 2018. If you know of a better way to get the latest insider knowledge about crypto, to hear directly from the top minds in this field, to interact personally with 800 fellow crypto lovers, hodlers, investors, miners, traders, developers, and founders, then I'd like to hear about it. If you don't, then you don't want to miss out. Register today for the Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference. Go to bitcoinsuperconference.com and register today as a super early bird to get the lowest rates on tickets and hotel rooms. That's bitcoinsuperconference.com.
Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost Here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with Future Tech Podcast. My guest is Steve Pannifer, a director at Consult Hyperion. Website is chyp.com. Steve, how are you?
Very good. How are you?
Good. Thanks so much for coming. So, tell me about Consult Hyperion. It's been around for a long time. Tell me about the company.
Yeah. So we're a boutique consulting firm, or technology consulting firm, another way of putting it. And we're about 45 people, so quite small, but perfectly formed, obviously. And over the last 30 years, we've been looking at innovations and developments in payments and identity in particular. And our background is, security technologies, transactional technologies, things like smart cards, mobile phones, things that you put in the consumer's hand that enable them to transact securely. And that's kind of our core expertise. But then how do you make that work for consumers today or tomorrow? And so we've managed to kind of been quite successful in following the development evolution in that whole kind of space over an extended period of time. And what that means is, of course, we're battle hardened, but also we have a lot of experience and knowledge to bring. So that's and we would call ourselves thought leaders as well. I think we whilst we've been around for 30 years, we managed to kind of keep ourselves fresh in terms of keeping up to speed with what's going on. We have lots of interesting customers which help, and we have a little prototyping lab as well. So we're always playing around with this stuff, right?
What's the main premise of Consult Hyperion? What do you guys do?
Yeah, so our view, and I think you'd agree with this, is that when you look at any transaction that someone does digitally, buying something, accessing a government service, and I'm thinking particularly about transactions that individuals, that consumers do. So, accessing a government service, I don't know, doing something health related, whatever it might be, there are two key enablers that make those transactions possible. The first thing is, obviously, you need to be able to pay quite often, particularly obviously in retail, that's important. And actually the internet wasn't, a lot of the payments that we have today were designed before the internet. So card payments were designed before the internet. So the way that they've existed on the internet has often been a bit suboptimal. So we've been involved with lots of the main players in the payment space, card networks, banks, those kinds of organisations, looking for ways to make payments work better. The other area, the other kind of key enabler that you need for any kind of transaction is you need to know who you're dealing with, right? You need to know if it's say you're accessing a government service and that government service is paying out benefits, for example, or paying you some money, then the government needs to know that they're paying the right person. So identity is a very important part of all transactions as well. And identity can operate at different levels, right? You can have some services where actually you don't really care that much about the precise sort of legal identity of the individual, in which case, you're just kind of interested in maybe them asserting who they are. But there are other types of service, government, health, banking, regulated services where you actually have to know to quite a strong level who the individual is, legally who the individual is. And so we're involved in kind of innovating in that space as well.
So, you would think that by virtue of having an account that you could verify, who someone says they are, but What are the factors that confound that? Why is extra verification needed? Or what?
Yeah, you've put your finger right on the problem right there. So I have an account with, my bank. I have an account with every retailer that I transact with. I have an account maybe with the government. I have an account with my health provider. And all of those accounts currently will be secured, often with passwords. That creates a lot of friction for me as a customer. It creates a lot of issues for me as well. So let's suppose I have an account with an online email provider for my email, and then I have an account with a health provider, say, and because I'm not able to manage lots of passwords, I use the same password in both, right? Or I use the email account as the mechanism of resetting the password in the health provider. Right. Then you can see there's all sorts of problems that can arise there, where a compromise in a weak system actually creates a problem in the strong system, because it doesn't matter how good the health provider is at managing their password vault, for example, the fact that my password is compromisable elsewhere creates a problem across the whole system. And there's this whole issue at the moment of fragmentation. Basically, I have my personal data is stored in lots of different places. One of the things that we're all experiencing at the moment is things like spam email. This arises as a result of me having created accounts with various organisations, retailers, whoever, having maybe opted in or accidentally not opted out of my data being used by those organisations. That data then gets sold on, associated with my email address, for example, and then there's this big mess of stuff that's kind of completely out of control. So my privacy is at risk. My security online is at risk. I mean, maybe it sounds like I'm scaremongering, but I think there is a genuine problem here for individuals in that they really don't know. They really kind of operate in an environment where there's a lack of control and a lack of transparency and visibility about what's actually going on, which creates uncertainty, and ultimately it means that valuable services find it more difficult to grow.
So what are some of the things that you guys have done to help facilitate identifying that a payment's coming from the right account? Maybe give me a few examples.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a long way to go. I can assure you of that. So there have been several initiatives in the industry. Now, I can point to some examples, actually, of some success stories. These are not necessarily things that we've been directly involved with, but my particular role, so I'm a director of Consult Hyperion, but I have a particular interest in digital identity, which kind of why I've taken the conversation in this direction a little bit. And in that role, as a subject matter expert around digital identity, I'm talking to lots of initiatives around the world. I know lots of different stakeholders, people that are involved in trying to solve these problems. Okay, and so the sorts of things that have been attempted. So there are government-led identity schemes. So you can imagine. So in Europe, for example, lots of governments have issued digital identities in one form or another to their citizens. Often those are based around a smart card. Those tend to be quite difficult to integrate into digital services because you need a card reader, and also they're not they're not that easy to use. I mean, it's kind of you've got to remember to have the card with you, so it doesn't work if you're out and about. And then the whole kind of user experience of putting a card in is perhaps not the sort of the latest experience in terms of technology. It's certainly not very mobile focused. You have with identity and with payments as well. Actually, you have on the one side individuals who want to pay for something or who want to assert their identity. So there's kind of consumer end, and then on the other side you've got what you might call relying parties or service providers, people that want to consume those identities. So they want to determine that you're entitled to access their services. And so you have this kind of two-sided market. In payments, we talk about issuers and acquirers. In identity, we talk probably about identities and relying parties, probably. And that two-sided market usually requires some organization or something in the middle to make the market work, and that's what the scheme would be, right? So the governments run schemes for their own benefit. So they're kind of they're operating the system in the middle, but they're issuing cards out to their citizens, and then on the other hand, they've got government departments who are those relying parties who want to get access to those cards.
Okay, and I was going to ask you when you're done with your next example. I was going to ask you, okay, so that's how the governments tend to do it. What's a better way to do it? But before we get there, go ahead with your...
Well, yeah. So I think, so the problem with governments doing it is, so there are great examples, in Estonia, for example, fantastic example of a government that has been very successful in rolling out an identity scheme, and they've got it integrated into all sorts of public and private sector applications. But it's unique, it's standalone. No other country has managed to do it in quite the same way. In some countries, so in the UK, for example, there's a lot of caution about the government controlling identity, particularly, there's caution about the government controlling identity for its own purposes, let alone for the private sector, because people are worried about surveillance. In some countries, there have been cases where, maybe and this is perhaps moving outside of the West into emerging markets, where perhaps the government is young, or perhaps you think there's a risk that the government might change in the future and can maybe want to compromise the privacy of its citizens. So there are kind of moral reasons or ethical reasons why you might want to set up a system that's a little bit detached from government. So but on the other hand, government is often the authoritative source of information about citizens. I mean, a lot of countries run registers, for example, or they issue passports or driver's licenses. So there are definitely roles that a government can play, but should it become this kind of holistic, all-encompassing identity for everything that we do? I'm not sure about that. So the next place to go would be some kind of regulated entity like a bank. And in fact, when we think about what do banks do? Well, for individuals, they help to manage an individual's money, their finances, right? And I've already sort of drawn this importance of payments and identity as being two key enablers. So you can imagine that a bank already playing a role in helping citizens to manage their money might play a role in helping citizens to manage their data, for example, or their identity. And identity and data are two kind of very closely associated terms. So there is a great example here, which is in the Nordics. So Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland have schemes that are run by the banks. They're often called, so the Norwegian and the Swedish schemes are called Bank ID. They're two different schemes in each country, but they're both called Bank ID. What happened in those countries? Banks had their own kind of online security problems. They wanted to enable access to online banking securely, so they created a scheme for themselves where banks were issuing identities to their citizens, and they did it in a collaborative way, such that you could take an identity that you've gone through an onboarding process, a know your customer process with, say, one bank in Norway. You then decide you want to open a bank account with another bank in Norway. You don't have to go through that laborious process where you've got to show up with all your documents and they've got to do all the checks and everything again. You can just take the digital version of your identity from the first bank and assert it digitally to the other bank, right? And because they're collaborative, they managed to make that work. Now, interesting point in Norway and those other countries as well is that when you go through that onboarding process for a bank account, one of the things that they're doing as part of their due diligence for their customers is they're checking you against the national register, because in those countries they have national registers which you're put onto at birth, which is recognised by the government, right? And so then you have a situation where you've got an identity scheme, the Bank ID scheme, but actually it's like a proxy for the government's register. And so what's happened in those countries is the government has said, actually, that works really well for us. We'll take that and use that and use that to allow citizens to log on or to access our digital government services. So there you have, and those schemes have been around for some years. So what you have is a scheme where you've got the bank as a sort of regulated entity. It's not government, but it's close enough to government that government can use it. And where they are at the moment, I think generally is they're looking at, okay, we've got something that works well for banks and public services. Can we also make it work in the private sector for non-banking, non-payment related private services? There are other places where there are similar things going on. I mean, I can keep going. I don't know how much time we've got. I could literally keep talking about this for days. So be warned.
Well, let's talk more about some specific applications of your guys' solution. Give me an example of one that you implemented that works really well, taught you some good lessons.
Yeah.
Showed you what to do for the future.
Yeah. So I'll tell you about something we've been involved in, which is, I think, going to be very important. It's a leading project at this instant, which is I don't know whether you're familiar, but the banks in Canada have been collaborating together this year on what they're calling an attribute exchange system. It's with a company called SecureKey. Now, there's a little bit of background in that SecureKey in Canada did something very similar to the bank ID thing that I talked about in Norway a couple of years ago. And what that does is it allows you to use your online banking log-on or your online banking sort of authentication to log on to government, which takes away part of that kind of password problem that I mentioned earlier in the call. So the fact that I have a secure bank-grade authentication that I use when I log on to my bank, and I can use the same thing when I log on to government, that's good for me as a citizen, because I'm using something that my bank credential, my bank logon, I'm using frequently. So to then use that again for government is easy for me. And what it also means is if there were a problem, then I'm likely to notice it. If my authentication thing got compromised, I might notice. Whereas the bank one the government one that I only use once a year, I might not notice. Right. So that's the background. The way that they set up the scheme in Canada was very strong on privacy. They have this concept of blinding, where the bank doesn't know which government department you're logging onto. The government doesn't know where you bank, who you bank with, and security in the middle don't know who you are. And they do all this cryptographically, so they have sort of cryptographic blinding across the parties. They wanted to move into beyond just straightforward log-on into sharing of personal data. In other words, I want to share my bank verified name and address with either a government department or with any other organisation that happens to be there. But how do you do that in a way that protects the privacy of the individual? And Canada has a very strong set of data protection and privacy legislation. And so you could imagine that if you want to say I'm sharing my address with somebody, or actually let's pick something else. Say I'm sharing my age with somebody, and the bank knows my age because that's part of their know your customer process. The bank could encrypt it to send to the other party, but then the other party, they would have to have the key of the other party, so they get to know who the other party is. They could send it into the middle to SecureKey, and then SecureKey re-encrypt it and send it to the other party. So neither party knows who each other is, but SecureKey in the middle get to know because they have to unwrap and rewrap the data. And so what SecureKey have done, and I'll get onto what our involvement is in a second. What SecureKey have done is they have realized that they can achieve the same level of privacy control, blinding, preventing of kind of surveillance across the system through the use of distributed ledger technology. So it's not that there's a lot more to this than I can possibly say in this call, except to say that they're constructing a system which uses DLT, also uses a kind of personal data store concept, and it has the banks on board, and they are currently in the process of building that together with SecureKey to provide what potentially is going to be a really interesting way of sharing, a very high value data that's been verified, that will enable a lot of these kind of high value services that have been perhaps inhibited up to this point in time. Our involvement, we've been working for one of the banks in the consortium, providing them with advice on the market opportunity. So looking at where digital identity is required, where the gaps are, who needs it, this kind of thing, where the pain points are that can be addressed, helping them with thinking about operationally what they should be doing, looking at security, looking at risks across the system, that kind of thing. So
what about for the unbanked? I mean, this is a good solution for people that are banked, but what about unbanked or unbankable people?
Yeah, so that is a really important point, and it's there's been one of the things that I'm encountering a lot is that giving digital identities to people who have no digital footprint or no financial footprint is hard. And certainly when you think of, and in actual fact, when you look at this isn't just an emerging market problem, but it's perhaps more pronounced in emerging markets, in environments where there's limited access to financial services. Those financial services in emerging markets have to comply with the same anti-money laundering rules as financial services in the other markets. And so if you don't have a government-issued identity, if you weren't registered at birth, I mean, if you don't even have the documents, let alone the digital version of those documents, bringing people into the system is very difficult. So we've been working with the World Bank on that topic, and with one or two other organisations. So there's an organisation called the Intermediary Network, who are leaders in sort of financial inclusion, bringing people out of poverty, that kind of thing. So, and we've been providing them, guidance, input, direction on what's the latest state of advancements in DLT, in digital identity, how those things can be leveraged to provide new approaches. There's no silver bullet to this, right? But there are lots of interesting projects going on. And it's a really important topic because obviously that's where we can make most difference to people's lives. So we're really interested in that whole space. And ultimately, actually, when you look at digital identity and payments, a lot of what has been done up to this point in time, it's people looking for where they can get the return on their investment. Right, the interests of consumers often are not really top of the list of priorities. So it's been great to be involved with some of those organisations who have a slightly different set of objectives, and maybe they're not driven completely by commercials. So that's
okay.
Which ultimately is for the good of everyone.
So yeah, just a couple last questions because it's great. I'm glad you're passionate about this stuff and you could talk about it a long time. What's coming for Consult Hyperion next year out? Any big breakthroughs potentially coming in the ID space?
Well, so in the UK, I didn't have a chance to talk about the UK. There's a lot going on in the UK in the identity space. There's been an initiative around the government called Gov.UK Verify, which we're hoping will open out into the private sector and hopefully create a marketplace for identity. I think there's Canada and the UK in particular are really busy, and I think there's potential for something to happen there. The other thing I would say as well is obviously we haven't touched on anything like Internet of Things, but when we think about the proliferation of devices, different transaction types, all sorts of different interactions, things that we can't possibly imagine at the moment, then lots of our customers are thinking about, well, okay, what's the role? How do payments work in that environment? Is there such a thing as kind of an invisible payment where a device is actually paying for something, authorized to pay for something on your behalf? And then how does it manage the control of the data that you've given it access to sort of process on your behalf? So I think in the IoT space, there's a lot of land grab going on. There's lots of innovation. A lot of that's being done without much thought to data security, which is, concerning. So obviously anything that we can do to be involved there and help steer people in a sensible direction is obviously something that we would try and do.
Well, very good. I'm sorry we're out of time. I know there's a lot more you could cover, but let's give people resources that are listening. How can they get in touch with Consult Hyperion and talk to you about these issues?
Yeah, so we have a website, chyp.com. We have a Twitter handle @chippings, that's CHYPPINGS. There's an email address, I think it's info@chip.com. So drop us a line, or look for me on LinkedIn or something. We'll be very pleased to speak to people.
Great. Steve, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
No worries.
The Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference is coming to Dallas, Texas, February 16, 17, and 18 in 2018. If you know of a better way to get the latest insider knowledge about crypto, to hear directly from the top minds in this field, to interact personally with 800 fellow crypto lovers, hodlers, investors, miners, traders, developers, and founders, then I'd like to hear about it. If you don't, then you don't want to miss out. Register today for the Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference. Go to bitcoinsuperconference.com and register today as a super early bird to get the lowest rates on tickets and hotel rooms. That's bitcoinsuperconference.com. You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies,
that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.